And now we are off to Inventions and the Market Revolution, still in period 4. Sorry, 1800 to 1848, Unit 11. So, in this unit, we're going to talk about a lot of inventors. And one of the most well known is somebody I'm sure you've all heard of, Eli Whitney. And he is most famous for creating the cotton gin. So, he patented this machine in 1794. And look at the time period here. By the 1840s, a million bales of hay per cotton were coming out of the South. And cotton was literally called King Cotton. So here's the story behind that. Eli Whitney traveled into the South and he watched slaves as they were working in the cotton fields. Now, cotton at the time was not a giant crop. It was not grown by very many farmers. And the reason is because it was so hard to harvest. Usually, the black male slaves were put into the fields to pick it. Um, it doesn't get very tall tobacco, so they were in a stooped position all day long. And the cotton, you may not know this, but comes out of that pod that you see here very sticky. It's almost like a thin layer of honey that it's covered in. So not only are the men bending over all day long, destroying their backs, but it's really hard to get the cotton off of the pod here, off of yourself, off of your fingers, and into the bag. So just that process takes long enough, but you have the men out in the field picking it, and the women were waiting for the men to bring them cotton so that the women could go through it and take out the seeds that you see in the second picture here. So if you pull cotton apart out of that pod, you pull it off the pod, it's sticky, you pull it apart, you see all these seeds inside, and these seeds are like ink. If you get them wet, they explode and they ruin the cotton. They turn it brown or blackish brown, and you can't get the stain out. So these women have to be very careful about not getting the cotton wet. They have to pick all these horrible seeds out of this cotton. It takes forever, just that part of it. But add to it, too, the fact that cotton has these little teeny tiny shards in it, like teeny tiny invisible pieces of glass. So these women, as they're picking through the cotton, they're actually slicing their fingers. Now it's a small enough slice that you don't really feel it until you have tons of them all over the tips of your fingers. Well, blood will also destroy the cotton. So these women can't get blood on the cotton. They're constantly dipping their hands in water to rinse the blood. They pick a little bit more, they rinse their fingers, they pick a little bit more, and now their skin is getting more and more viable and more susceptible to being cut. So these poor women are just shredding their fingers, and the poor men out in the fields are breaking their backs. Eli Whitney sees this, wants to do something to help, so he creates this invention. It only takes him 11 hours to figure out how to put together this invention with a couple of rollers and a brush, and you shove the cotton just picked out of the field into this machine. I'm sorry, first you have to lay it out in the sun and let that kind of honey residue solidify so it's not sticky anymore. Then you throw it in the machine, and you basically crank the machine a few times. It combs all the seeds out. Voila, you're done. So now the females are not really needed to pick it. They can go out in the fields. So overnight, cotton is going to be the crop to grow because now you can use all your slaves out in the fields and only have maybe one or two that are actually cranking on the cotton gin. It produces it, cleans it very, very quickly. And then when you go to ship it, guess what? You're charged by the pound, and cotton doesn't weigh anything. So it is the perfect crop to send not just to the north to the industries growing up there, but also to European markets because it is so cheap to ship. So Eli Whitney thinks he's doing a really good thing, but in fact, slavery had shown serious signs of dying out by 1794 and probably would have died out on its own. But now all of a sudden they have this brand new crop that can make tons and tons of money. And remember, 1808, you can't get any more new slaves, but they still need them because cotton is going to be king by the 1840s. And so it makes slavery worse than ever before. The need for slaves more than ever before. And again, we have no way to get them from outside of the United States. So you can imagine what's going to happen in that need to have all these slaves for King Cotton. So meant to do a nice thing, but it ended up ended up not being such a great thing. Now, Eli Whitney, again, you probably learned about him and the cotton gin when you were very young, but there's a couple of other things you may not know that he invented. Eli Whitney is the first guy ever to use the assembly line, so he invented it. I know Henry Ford always gets the credit for it. He is the first to get rich from it, but he did not invent it. It was Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney, along with the invention of the assembly line, invented the very first gun with interchangeable parts, and that's what was put together on his assembly line. So he did the cotton gin, he did the assembly line, and he did interchangeable parts for guns, which will lead to interchangeable parts for basically everything you can think of. Most things that you have in your house right now have interchangeable parts, and that all started with Eli Whitney. So a good guy with a big heart that didn't mean to do harm to the slave population, but did. So we have the cotton that we can put into the factories to make things out of, but we don't have a factory yet. So the factories are actually going to start with a guy by the name of Sam Slater. Now we were in competition with Britain trying to get our industrial revolution started, and we weren't doing a great job of it. But Sam Slater was actually in Britain, and he went kind of undercover to work in a factory in Britain. And in Britain, it was a law for you that employees were not allowed to tell any secrets of what they saw inside these mills and factories. So if you were caught telling your spouse, your children, a friend, whoever, what you saw and how it worked in these factories, you could get into a lot of trouble for it. But Sam wanted this secret. He wanted to bring it to America. So Sam went in as an employee, and when no one was paying attention, he would pace the floors, marking off how many feet he needed for each room, how big the machines were, how many people he needed for each machine. And he would go home at night and he would document all these things. And when he felt like he was ready, he ran away and he went to America in 1789. And in Providence, Rhode Island, with the help of Quakers, he builds the very first water powered cotton spinning machine in America. And this is where America begins her industrial revolution in, of all places, Providence, Rhode Island, the place that we used to put all the crazy religious fanatics. And now it's going to be the home of the Industrial Revolution. So Sam Slater gets the name Father of the American Factory System. And what's cool about his factory system is that he actually built a town around the factory. So it wasn't just a factory; it was a town that was self-sufficient, completely independent. They did not need other people or other people's goods, and he invited whole families to come and work in this town and work in his mills. And it was a good, clean place for people to be a family, and that's what he wanted, and he was very successful. Ergo, he gets the name the father of the American factory system. Now, others will take the idea of what Sam Slater did, and they will open other factories in other cities. And a great example is the Lowell factory in Massachusetts. Now, the Lowell brothers decided that they would take the same idea, make textile factories, only they are going to be the biggest mass producers in the coast at the time. So they actually outproduce Sam Slater's idea of what should be coming out of his industry. So by 1840, the Lowell system had 8,000 workers, and if we ever doubted it before, there was no way to doubt it by 1840. The Industrial Revolution in America was real. Now, the Lowell factory was different in many ways. Like I said, they did employ more people. Sam Slater, though, wanted to make sure that families were invited to create this community, and he built the town around the factory. But the Lowell factory was built inside a town that already existed, and most of the labor inside of that factory was going to be females. The Lowell factory was, like I said, in a town, but it was surrounded by farm country. And when he visited local farmers, he realized that these people had a problem. They did not have enough food to feed their children. Many of them were Catholic, which meant that they were very adamant that you not prevent birth from abstinence or any kind of birth control. So they had too many kids. A lot of them were females, and we're still in a time period where females are not a lot of good to a farm family. They're not going to go out and work in the fields beside the boys. Mom only needs so many hands at home, and so they are a real burden to their family. Not that they don't love them, they're their children, but they are in fact a burden. And so the Lowell factory system invites these females to come live in the town of Lowell in a dormitory. They are given an opportunity to be educated, and they work in the factories, and it's going to be the daughters. So you're inviting females at the age of like 12 or 13 years old to come work in the factory, get an education they would not have been able to get at home. They make money, which they split with their parents. So mom and dad are making money off of their female children. The children are not a burden on their family anymore. In fact, they were actually helping. So it sounds great. But what do you notice about the girl in the picture? Her hair. One of the first things that ended up happening to these little 12 or 13-year-old girls is they went into the factory, and it was realized right away that their hair had to go. It was getting caught in the machinery and actually scalping the girls. So their hair had to go, which was not socially acceptable at the time. You also had these little girls fighting society's disbelief about females working in such an environment and breaking that cult of domesticity where the girls are supposed to be at home living with mommy and daddy and doing girl things and learning how to be a good wife and a good mother. So these little girls really are faced with a lot of societal upset at what their new plight in life is. But here's the thing, they're 12 or 13 years old. They've been a burden to their family. Now they have an opportunity to live in a town where, by the age of 15, maybe 16, they're going to find a husband. They're single men in this town. And so the little girls are willing to cut their hair and go against the cult of domesticity and society's booing them to have this opportunity in life and to help their families out. Now, the problems were deeper than that, though. It wasn't realized right away, but there were some serious, serious health issues. These factories were textiles, and you're using cotton and wool, and either one will produce giant, giant amounts of dust in the air. I mean, large amounts where when you walk through the room, it looks like it's snowing. So these girls are number one, that causes lots of clogs in the machines. All these loose threads and stuff floating in the air. So the girls are constantly bent over, constantly. And after a couple years, these young healthy girls now have a permanently bent back from bending over all the time. They're also breathing in these giant dust particles, and it's clogging their lungs and absorbing the moisture in their lungs. And suddenly they sound like they've been smoking for 30 years and have these distorted voices, and they wheeze when they breathe. Not so super attractive here. And the worst part of it was that those little pieces of cotton, especially, were embedding themselves in the girl's skin. Remember, I told you that it has these little, like, almost like shards of glass in it, and it's piercing the girl's skin, embedding itself in her skin, absorbing all the oils in her skin, and turning her old. So here's a 15-year-old who looks like she's 40 with wrinkles in her face. So she can't stand up straight. She has short hair. Half of society hates her because she's breaking that domesticity rule. She can't breathe. She doesn't talk right. She looks old. Nobody is going to marry this child even at 15 years old. She seems too old and decrepit. So what happens to these children who are supposed to come here to have this wonderful life? They end up being sent back to their families with disabilities, and now they are a burden on their families. Now, this is not what was supposed to happen with the Lowell factories or any factories, but it is going to end up happening. Now, the Lowell factory is still there today. This is what it looks like, and it actually has been turned, a lot of it's been turned into a mall, so you can go to the Lowell factory and hang out, but you can see how they use turn the waterway here into a canal and use the power of that canal to make the power to run the machines inside the factory. Very, very cool setup, and it worked. It just wasn't super healthy. Now, this is a time for inventions, and I know it sounds kind of weird, but we're going to talk about the guy who invented business and entertainment, and that guy is Phineas Barnum. You might know him as P.T. Barnum, or Barnum and Bailey Circus. So let's see how this ended up coming to fruition. Phineas Barnum was a very, very smart little kid, and when he was like 7 and 8 years old, he already knew how to make cherry rum, and he knew how to make it very well. So he would make large batches of it whenever there was a local event, and he would bring cups and the cherry rum with him and sell it and made a lot of money. So by the time he was 12, he was old enough to buy his own livestock, start his own farm. By 21, as you can see here, he had a general store, a small lottery, his own newspaper called the Herald of Freedom. And in that newspaper, he decided to do a kindness for people who had a hard time finding a job because they had something unique about them. So, say somebody that was much taller than normal or much smaller than normal, or maybe you have an extra thumb, or these things that people thought made you weird, for lack of a better word, or unhireable. And so you could come down to his Herald of Freedom and you could put in an ad for free saying, here's what I have to offer. Yes, I do have too many thumbs, but I can still do the job, blah, 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 blah. Well, it didn't work very well, but he did end up meeting some very, very unique people. And he starts using them as, for lack of a better word, a freak show. And he started making a lot of money off of it. And so by the time that he's 60, he has his very own three-ring circus. But the core of his circus is still these unique people that he portrays as freaks. And like I said in the beginning, he's the first to make a business out of entertaining people. Now, he had lots of characters that were well known at the time, but the two shows that really made him famous was, first of all, Tom Thumb. And Tom Thumb here that you see, the small guy, was actually in his 30s, and so he was a very unique character, and he would come out on stage, and of course, he talked like an adult, and he smoked and smoked cigars especially, and he was quite a show catcher. The other show that made him a lot of money is the twins that you see here, and I've researched this. I can't find a positive ID for the true name of the twins, so I know he billed them as the twins, so we're just going to go with that. But P.T. Barnum became famous for his freaks and his freak show, and I can't decide if I like him or not. He made money for out of people's sorrow, but nobody else was hiring him. Was he a good boss? We don't really know, but it gave these people a paycheck and a home, so I don't know. You'll have to make up your own mind about that. So after P.T. Barnum, it's kind of hard to go back to the ordinary, but we got to go back to Cyrus McCormick. And Cyrus McCormick is the best friend to a farmer. He invented the mechanical reaper, and a mechanical reaper cuts down long, like hays, that kind of thing, long grasses. Now, it does make it so that you don't have to use as many workers in the field, because they used to have to get out there and cut it down with a machete. But Cyrus McCormick made this invention, and so you don't need them to cut it down. This machine cuts it, lays it in a little pile, and then the workers just come behind the machine and pick it up. Done. So it saved a lot of work. Didn't need as many slaves, because remember, this is still slave period. It did have a couple flaws, not huge, but it was loud, and the sound was kind of annoying, and it often scared the horses. so you did have to have slaves walking alongside the horses in case they tried to bolt because they were afraid. And you don't mess with a scared horse. So you did have slaves that got injured because of it. So there was a downside, but that didn't happen a lot. And so the good of the machine did more good than the bad did bad. So I know that sounded weird, but hey, go with it. And now we're at Sam Morse. You know his name because of Morse code, but before he invented the code, he had to invent the telegraph. And so he did. He did this quite by accident. Sam Morse was actually an artist, and his dream was always to have a painting in the Louvre. He was pretty well known at the time. He did paint portraits of very famous people, and they sat for him. They asked him to paint them. So you see in front of you four very famous people that he painted the portraits of. John Adams and James Monroe portraits are in the White House. He never will get a painting in the Louvre, but he was very good. So he's this artistic kind of guy, and he's doing okay with his artwork, but not fantastic. But he has a wife and two children. His wife is very pregnant. They're happy. Wifey goes into labor. She delivers a beautiful girl baby named Sarah, and then mom just kind of goes to sleep and dies. So Sam, of course, is very, very upset, but he has three children to worry about, so he plows onward. And then his dad dies, and then his mom dies. And so Sam is just completely engulfed in sorrow and decides to go to Europe and kind of settle himself and find a better place inside his own head. And so he leaves his children with a relative, travels to Europe, finds peace, he's on his way back on a ship, and he ends up being roomed with this guy who's a scientist. And I know this sounds really nerdy, but they start talking about sound waves and how they travel, and how could you get sound waves to travel through a man-made mechanism. And the more this science guy, whose name we do not know, the more that the science guy talked, the more Sam drew it out. So by the time that they end up back in America, these two are very good friends, and together they develop the telegraph. And it is Sam that will go on and develop the Morse code. So he takes it to the president, and the president makes a deal with him that if it works and he can prove to him that it works, then he will pay using federal funds to draw a telegraph line from DC to Baltimore, Maryland. And so the experiment is done in the White House from one room to another. It does work. And so the money is given to Sam to develop the actual line from DC to Baltimore, Maryland. And the line you see in front of you, or the quote you see in front of you, is what was actually typed out for the very first time on this line from DC to Baltimore, Maryland. And the text was, "What hath God wrought?" So that is Sam Morse. Now, here is a picture of a painting that he did. It's called Gallery of the Louvre. He included 38 paintings or statues that are actually truly found in the Louvre, hoping that the Louvre would accept it. But they did not. A private buyer purchased it, and in the 1980s, the family that owns it brought it out to have it looked at and have it appraised, and it appraised at what you see before you, $3.25 million, and it has not made a public appearance since. So you can probably pick out a few paintings here. The one most noticeable, of course, is the Mona Lisa there at the bottom. Liberty Leading the People was in here somewhere. You see the statue of Diana over here. So all stuff that's in the Louvre. He was a great painting, like I said. He just never did end up getting anything in the Louvre. So let's move on to Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton is one of the guys that is given the title of the creator of the steam engine. And because of this creation, we end up getting the very first steamboat, the Claremont of New York, and the world's first steam warship or submarine, the Nautilus, which will be a precursor to other submarines that will be used in the Civil War. They're not super safe. They haven't really worked out all the kinks yet. And so submarines, even during the Civil War in 1860, will be known as the Widowmaker. But this steam engine was used for lots of different things and really helped trade, helped in times of war. So Robert Fulton is given credit for a very big invention. And here is a picture of that Nautilus. You can see the kind of weird balloon looking sail that they developed that also helped to propel the ship forward. When they weren't trying to hide underwater, they could put that up, and it was pretty successful. When they wanted to actually do harm to another ship and submerge, see the paddle here that is labeled with the letter D. You got close enough to a ship that was above water, and you ran that paddle on the underbelly of the ship, and it would just rip it to shreds. And then you could keep going. Sometimes they even put a torpedo charge on that paddle. It would, of course, blow the paddle up, but it would do serious damage to the boat above because boats were made of wood back then. So it didn't have to be a giant, powerful torpedo that would hurt the ship that actually was exploding it. You know, it didn't hurt the Nautilus. It wasn't that powerful, but it was powerful enough to put a pretty big hole in the hull of the ship above and sink them. All right, so you have all these people that have new, unique jobs because of all these inventions that are happening. And so you of course had massive numbers of people that just did ordinary jobs that they didn't really have to understand a craft to do. You know, these people that are working assembly lines and things like that didn't know a craft. But you do start getting these very specialized workers that begin to organize themselves into what we call guilds or craft guilds. It's actually a form of union, but these workers are specialized. They're harder to replace, and so their voice is a lot louder than the tiny little hopeless, helpless voice of an average factory worker. And so these craft guilds really jump on board with the idea of how long do we have to work, what kind of money are we going to make, and how is my employer allowed to treat me. Same issues that you probably heard a million times when you talk about the Industrial Revolution. So ordinary everyday workers were worried about the same thing, but again, their voice was not loud as the craft guilds. And so when it's hard to replace somebody, the bosses are much more likely to listen. So the craft guilds will actually be pretty powerful and really get some things done for workers in the early 1800s. So the cities are filling up, they're getting dirty, they're getting overcrowded, and there's cheap farmland in the Midwest. So, of course, there's going to be Western migration. By 1860, a third of our population is living in the Midwest. So that's a huge amount of people that are not connected to the East Coast and need to be, not just for them, but for the East Coast as well. Lots of trading could be happening if we had a way to connect the eastern industrial states with these new Midwest towns that are developing, right? So, because you need to connect these two places, the Midwest and the East Coast, you have a transportation revolution. And the National Road is something that was discussed during the very first year of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. I believe it was 1807 when they finally started really building it. But it is Jefferson that starts it, sets it up, gets permission from Congress to get federal funding. And so this road goes from Baltimore, Maryland, all the way to St. Louis. Today it's known as the Cumberland Road, but it still exists. So again, it's used as federal money to be built, and then the federal government, once it was done, turned it over to the individual states and said, "Now you guys have to maintain it." So Maryland, West Virginia, all these places that have this road going through them had to maintain it. They had to come up with a way to get the money to maintain it. People weren't going to want to pay taxes on it, and so we get our very first toll roads in America because of that national road. Now, sometimes a road can't be built, and sometimes you need a canal instead of a road. And a really good example of that would be the state of Michigan. Michigan had really good farmland, but the only way that traders really could get to them where it was worth going to them would be if they could travel up the Hudson River from New York and somehow connect to Lake Erie right there at Michigan, and so they could get their goods to the state of Michigan. Well, when people first started moving there was no way to go from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. There was that territory that you see here between the Hudson and Lake Erie was very, very swampy. It was known as the Black Swamp. And if you wanted to risk your life and probably lose it, sure, you could try and take your goods through there, but it was not a safe place to be. Things got stuck in the mud, horses, wagons. Indians were still there waiting for silly white people to come through there and get stuck. And so it is not a safe place. So New York decides that they're going to build a canal. And so it is funded by the states. It costs $7 million. It takes 3 years to build, which is phenomenal. The amount of time that it took, that's hardly any time at all. And so now, for the first time, you can successfully transport goods up the Hudson, across the Erie Canal, and over to Lake Erie and to Michigan. Steamboats are also a new innovation that allows trade and movement and contact between these new places in the Midwest. Steamboats made the Mississippi River a two-way river. It used not to be. But now with steamboats it is. Railroads, you can go anywhere with a railroad pretty much as long as you have a way to lay track and get it through. So you have all these brand new types of transportation vehicles and ways to get there: the roads, canals, steamboats, and railroads. Now, the canals and the steam power, that includes railroads now, steam power, made faster mail, increased industry in the north. Both sound fantastic. It does increase Western settlement. Great, we're spreading our population out. But faster mail also allows propaganda to spread much faster. Increased industry in the north puts an even deeper line between that industrial north and the agricultural south. And so that faster mail, where they can badmouth each other quicker, more efficiently, and that increased gulf between the north and the south because of new industry in the north, is very much setting that stage towards the Civil War. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot through this. I just want you to see who's doing what during this time period. Notice that the Midwest is basically offering both the Northeast and the South the same thing. So when the Civil War does come along a much later, because they're feeding both the North and the South, and both of the North and the South are going to want the Midwest on their side. So it's going to be a job trying to convince the Midwest who to go to, and we'll get to that when we talk about the Civil War. But know that this, by 1848, and this is the end of the period now, 1848, this is what America looks like. Very, very different from one another. Nobody's too worried about the Midwest being different because, again, like I said, they're feeding everybody. So freeze right now, freeze the video, and write this stuff down, and I will talk at you again in a minute. So let's look at the changes in population. You do suddenly have urbanization. If you don't remember what that is from your world history classes, that is a rapid influx or rapid movement into the cities from the countryside. So, for whatever reason, people need to leave the country and come into the cities to find jobs. So, here's your major cities here, and probably you'll see it as a multiple choice, and I'll take one of them out. You got to figure out which one's missing. So, Chicago, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and of course, New York are going to be the five major cities in the Northeast. Immigrants of the time period were mostly in the early 1800s Irish. Most of them were Irish. Irish were not well liked. They had a terrible reputation as drunks and thieves. They did drink a lot. They were very, very poor, so they do end up doing some bad things because they need money to feed their family. They will be some of the first gangs in New York City, and gangs aren't very nice. And so the Irish are not well liked by American society. And to top it all off, they're in the northern states, mostly New York, but some go much further north, and they're Catholic. And so Catholics are not well liked in the North. The second largest group in the early 1800s are the Germans. Germans tend to move to the Midwest. They are more middle class. They're not a burden to society. They're not big drinkers, but they have a reputation for being mean. I think a lot of it is their language because it's so guttural. Sometimes it sounds like they're mad and they're not. So it could be just a misunderstanding. But some of them, a lot of them, are Catholic in this time period. So Irish and Germans are not well liked by most people in America, and did say most, and they don't like each other either. So it's a really rough place for both the Irish and the Germans in the United States at the time. So you can see a map here of the percentage of immigrants, and you can take a look at it yourself. But remember, there in the yellow, that 20% in the Midwest is going to be mostly German. That green and some of that yellow is going to be almost all Irish. And then notice that the South doesn't have nearly as many immigrants as the North. This is another thing that's going to set them apart because the factories in the North are filled with immigrants, whether the owners want to hire them or not, that's who's there. And the South, of course, is being worked by slaves. So I'm not talking about the moral issue of slavery. I'm just saying that even the workers are very different between the North and the South. So you've got this buildup of the differences between the North and South. It's a gradual buildup of I'm not like you, you're not like me, so we should probably hate each other. You know how we are. And that's the truth. And here we go with a diagram to show you the percentages. It doesn't change a whole lot from the 1820s to the 1860s. The number one group, like I said, coming in is Irish. And just after that is going to be the Germans. And again, don't forget, Americans didn't like them and they didn't like each other. And so, because of that hatred, especially of the Irish, you get the idea of nativism, or this idea that unless you're a white male, you definitely shouldn't have the right to vote. You shouldn't have any rights in America. And basically, if you're a nativist, you're a white male nativist, you hate anybody who's not a white male nativist. And so the hatred, of course, was focused mostly on Irish Catholics. And the thing that they propagated was that they believed that these Irish Catholics were anti Republican. And I'm not talking about the political party Republicans versus Democrats. I'm saying they're against the Republic of America. Like we vote, we're a republic. They're against that. And so they very often put out ads just like the one you see here. They're hiring people, but they are bold enough and allowed to say no Irish need apply. We won't hire you. We don't like Irish people. The nativists are the first ones in America to really start using mob violence as a means to scare these Irish Catholics to get them out of the neighborhoods. And of course, that's going to lead to the gangs for protection, especially in places like New York City. But mob violence means it's not really planned. It's a sudden, violent, horrible thing that happens where these people come together and do bad things. And usually it happens in times of recession because unemployed Protestants can say the Irish Catholics are taking our jobs, or the Catholics in general, it might be Germans, they're taking our jobs. And so that feeds the hate and turns into a mob, and the mob commits violence. So it's this domino effect. And so some people were so nativist that they created a political party called the Know Nothings. And the Know Nothings were, their goal was to make sure that no Catholics got the right to vote, especially Irish Catholics, and they really wanted them out of the country. But the least that they could do is to make sure they couldn't vote. And, of course, if they were questioned about it, they would say, I know nothing. And so there you go. And don't ask me why the ends are backwards on the flag. That's a picture of an actual flag from a nativist group. I don't know why it's backwards. I can't find it anywhere. I've looked and looked on the internet, can't find it. If you find it, hey, hit me up and let me know. I'm very curious too. So here's another one that I'm going to let you copy down. It is the last slide. Don't get super excited. You still have to write it all down, but mostly it's common sense. So America is divided in these social classes, and for the first time in America, we are very different from one another, not just North and South, but sometimes within your own city. And so you've got citizen versus citizen. And is the Republic in jeopardy? Well, yeah, of course it is, because we're ending in 1848 and the Civil War starts in 1860, silly children. All right, so I'm going to stop talking now. I will see you in the next unit. Write all this down and remember it for the test. And remember, do not wait till the night before to study for your test. Please.